on your screen?
No.
Right now, we're not seeing anything.
Maybe hold on. Okay, now can you see the video? No?
Yeah.
You can see the video?
Yeah.
Can you see Pratt? Like the Pratt logo?
Yeah.
All right, bet. Sorry about that.
Imagine getting pulled over and searched by the cops. Imagine having drugs planted in your car. Imagine a store owner following you. Imagine going to the wrong neighborhood. Imagine getting gunned down by police. Imagine being vilified. Imagine being tolerated but not accepted. Imagine a space protected by the Imagine a ghetto bird hovering over you. Imagine the cops riding up. Imagine being falsely accused. Imagine what it's like to be black in America. Wait.
When the lights shut off and it's my turn to settle down, my main concern, promise that you will sing about me, promise that you will sing about me. I said when the lights shut off and it's my turn to settle down, my main concern, promise that you will sing about me, promise that you will sing about me.
In the early hours of Sunday morning last, they raided the premises and discovered an after-hours drinking establishment, commonly called a blind pig. Their curiosity turned to hostility. They began shouting their disapproval. Empty bottles began to fly. Several store windows were shattered. Garbage cans were upended and the contents set on fire.
Later on in the afternoon, you could feel the tension that there was something going to happen, although you kept saying to yourself, I think it's over. But, later on that afternoon, it did start in the next day.
Promise that you sing about the fall, promise that you sing about the fall. Promise that you sing about the fall, brother. Promise that you sing about the fall.
What's good, everybody watching? I hope you are enjoying the visual mixtape. It's currently 3 a.m. and I wanted to slow it down a bit to talk more about the duality of the study. The first challenge that the project had to face was both the removal of the white box that modernism loves so dearly, while also removing the ideology of slavery in our daily lives, whether it be a slave to the state, a slave to modernism, or a slave to capitalism. We all know the concept of slavery and have an idea about the hierarchy and the effects that it has on blacks, including me to this day. In the modern world, America is using an old concept but creates a new package for the same ideology that has held us back for centuries. For example, mass incarceration of black Americans. Did you know during the crack epidemic, the minimum sentence for possession was 10 years, and you know what area they heavily policed? What about the fact that if you are placed in a privately owned prison, you are essentially a slave to the state? Did you know that the imprisonment rate of black males for drug charges are 6 times more than their white counterparts, even though the possession of drugs between each groups are the same? Must be a coincidence. Another example would be the factory worker in the same existing building that the alien and the alienated are taking over, who worked all day in a big box just to come home in a smaller box, all for the machine called capitalism. The list goes on. Another challenge was this idea of control. The red ant not only works with its own generational memory of creating canals, but it also works on its true desires. If you look at the Conjuring map, the areas that are blinking are the placement of the sugar water. Because the ants desire food, it will flock to any of the areas that are blinking to fulfill this need. You know what's crazy? Is that you can't take the Conjuring map at face value. During one of my pinups, I was explaining this idea of conjuring and how the ants flock to these desirable areas, and only one crit got the hidden layer of the Conjuring map. Shout out to Scott Ruff if you're watching. Dope guy. The hidden layer of the Conjuring map is the ideology of the desires of the African Americans as well. If you take those same conjuring areas and add some historical backgrounds of African Americans, you will see that the ants and us are one and the same. While some desire money, sex, cars, etc., most blacks desire the piece of the pie, the American dream. Going back to the end of slavery, blacks began moving to the north for freedom and a new beginning at life. However, this came with stipulations. Detroit in specific redlined the city and gave particular areas to black Americans migrating. What blacks thought was a beginning of a new life was actually a way to control the masses. They would use these desires to lure them in a trap. What I learned from this study is that if you can control one's desires, you can control them. You notice how in New York, NYPD mostly patrols the public housing areas. Literally as we speak, 3 police cars just passed my block on the east side of Detroit, a predominantly black neighborhood. It's because these areas were the original conjuring spots for African Americans. There are more similarities between the red ant and African Americans than just controlling the desires. For one, there's a hierarchy of respect between the queen and the worker ant, like my mother or grandmother and I. There's also the similarity of congregating underground. For example, red ants store their food and their dead underground and in the same exact places, while blacks plan majority of their movements underground, quote unquote, or in concealment. For example, the Underground Railroad, Black Panthers movement, Civil Rights movement, and BLM. Another similarity is how the oppressor views blacks and the red ant. Insects are seen as monsters, while black men in particular are vilified in America. It's pretty crazy to see how the oppressor responds to the quote-unquote monsters in these worlds. For example, when the ant is minding its business in the oppressor's kitchen, they kill it. And when they see African Americans minding their business, they...
911 operator Harris, where is your emergency?
I don't know what's happening. Somebody kicked in the door inside my girlfriend.
Okay, where are you located?
I'm at 3003 Street.
God bless you if it's good to you. America, please take my...
You said 26, where was she shot at?
I don't know. My girl, I don't know.
New Kung Fu Kitty.
Throw a steak off the ark to a pool full of sharks, he'll take it. Leave him in the wilderness with a sworn nemesis, he'll make it. Take the gratitude from him, I bet he show you something, whoa. I chip a nigga a little bit of nothing. I chip a nigga a little bit of nothing. I chip a nigga a little bit of nothing. I chip a nigga, then throw the blower in his lap. Walk myself to the court like, bitch, I did that.
Wait.
going down. Oh, but I hope I make it out. Out of doubt. But I hope I make it out.
Okay, cool. I'm going to play part of a documentary called Let the Fire Burn, just to kind of introduce it. Give me one sec.
Michael, you remember me from the last time you and I talked about a week ago? You see this camera over here, you're going to have to say yes so that camera can take down everything you say, because that camera can't take down something when you shake your head. Can you say yes for us? Let me hear you say yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty good. How about a little bit louder than that?
Yeah.
And we talked about what happened on the 13th of May. You remember that?
Yeah.
Now, Michael, do you know what it is to tell the truth about things? You're going to have to say yes. You can't shake your head. Okay. And what does it mean when you have to tell the truth about things?
Don't lie.
Don't lie. That's right. And do you know what happens to the people who lie?
Yeah.
What happens to them?
They get hurt.
They get hurt.
Yes, the big story on Action News tonight is the effort to evict Move from its house on the 6200 block of Osage Avenue. The effort has turned into a disaster.
The fire is now 5 alarms, still raging out of control, as you can see.
An unknown number of heavily armed Move members continue at large, possibly roaming the alleyways.
Going in, everybody knew that Move would resist anything.
While the police will say that they come here to arrest people, we have done nothing wrong.
We do not want policemen killed. We do not want the people in the house killed.
Fellow officer James Rapp was killed 7 years ago. They will never forget that.
Okay, this is unconfirmed. You got to emphasize this is unconfirmed. But Channel 10 technician Fran Hardy reports.
An incendiary device was dropped out of that helicopter. Nobody, Render, has ever seen anything like this. We expect that maybe 60, perhaps more homes have gone up in flames.
I stand fully accountable for the actions that took place tonight. How did an attempt to arrest Move members become an inferno that killed 11 people and destroyed 61 homes?
You can call the group reactionists, revolutionaries, terrorists.
That was a decision to let the fire burn.
On May 13th, 1985, years of conflict between the city of Philadelphia and a small urban group known as Move ended in a violent, day-long encounter between the group's members and the Philadelphia police. It was one of the most devastating days in the modern history of this city. Before we call the first witness, I want to tell you about this special commission. We are men and women, black and white, guided by our own attitudes and beliefs. What we hope to accomplish is to begin healing the wounds caused by the failure to resolve conflicting lifestyles in a peaceful way.
Six, five.
This is MOVE, the people in an organization that admits to being totally revolutionary. For the past 4 years, they've lived in the Powelton Village area of West Philadelphia, often running into conflicts with police. Their personal appearance has brought stares and some expressions of disapproval from the community, but it is what they do that counts, not how they look. In everything from work habits to child raising, MOVE is revolutionary.
I was indoctrinated with a philosophy in the past that revolution only meant picking up a gun and going out and murdering somebody. I never thought that revolution consisted of revolutionizing myself to get away from the things that caused me to want to revolt.
MOVE does not believe in technology. They use a wood-burning stove for heat and they have no electricity. But they do have cars and they have a telephone. Why? All the answers are in the guidelines, their Bible left by John Africa.
Ms. Sims, can you describe for me what the philosophy of MOVE was? What did John Africa teach with regard to the society in which you found yourself living?
You're asking what was being taught?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The absolute truth. We were being taught about this system, the corruption in this system, but mainly it was just the absolute truth.
What John Africa did was expose the lie in the system, uncover it.
Could you describe what you mean by the word the system, please?
The system, the establishment, you.
Philadelphia is a tortured city. Trash piles up at the curb line. Kids are afraid to walk to school. Abandoned homes pockmark the ghetto. Philadelphia needs a strong man for a tough job. Philadelphia needs Frank Rizzo as mayor.
A small vocal minority among us seeks to destroy the heritage of 1776. We must be ever vigilant that this minority does not impose its philosophy on the unwilling majority of Americans.
In their vigilant effort to maintain close contact with Mother Earth, the MOVE members are breaking up the cement of the sidewalk around their property.
But you have to have some kind of standard for your organization here. Yeah, right. You just know, but you are not animals. I mean, why not? I don't want to be personal. Oh, no, wait a minute, why not? See, we are animals because our reference is no different than the reference of animals. There's only one reference, and that's life. That's what MOVE is about, life, truth. But man, that's our religion. I'm saying this is what we taught by Father John Africa.
We see John Africa in the same way that people saw Jesus Christ because of his carpentry, because of his simple way of living, and so forth. Now we know that John Africa is the man who can explain Jesus Christ.
When Reverend Audrey Bronson wants to practice her religion, nobody beats her up. But when MOVE wanted to practice their religion, people started talking about it's not done that way. There are Catholics and Methodists, evangelists, theologians, you name it. We were the religion of life. Where is it written that we could not have a religion of our own?
Your brother, Vincent Leapart, was John Africa, is that correct?
My brother, Vincent Leapart, was my brother. John Africa was the founder of the MOVE organization.
And they were one and the same?
I said my brother was my brother. And I said John Africa was the founder of the MOVE organization. Vincent Leapart is my brother.
second. I'm gonna switch over to a presentation. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay. So what you just saw, the beginning of that was really just to kind of introduce to you the story about what I'm going to be talking about. So basically, in May 13th, it was mentioned at the beginning of the conversation or at the beginning of the film, there was a bomb that was dropped on a home in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, on 6221 Osage Avenue in Philly. And I'm just going to show you exactly kind of what happened. So basically, there was a bomb dropped on this house here. This is the MOVE headquarters in 1985. And this is the aftermath of that bomb. What happened was the authorities, the local government, the courts, and the mayor were all kind of in agreement to drop this bomb on the home of the MOVE members. And that was something that killed 11 people on the inside of the house. 5 of those people were children. And to me, that was kind of interesting because it was the first time I had seen or heard that a local government or a city had literally bombed itself. And that was relatively shocking to me. I think one thing that the studio that we talked about was being able to listen to the city, and being able to understand what the city tells you that you don't really know, because this is something that I had no idea. So I'm just going to keep going. So this is some imagery of the events that took place. What happened after the bomb was dropped? The police for 3 hours didn't take any time to go, or the fire department didn't have any time to go put out the fire, primarily because they wanted to break down some steel barriers that the MOVE members had put up in their house. But that ultimately resulted in the destruction of three rows of row homes in an entire city block in Philadelphia, based off of one bomb that was dropped on the city. Here's just more imagery of the aftermath. You kind of see some of the firewalls that still existed afterwards. But it was a significant event in the city that shook up a lot of the residents. One thing that I learned, at least learned about doing the research, was that I didn't know how close it was even towards like my family. My grandfather knew some of these people, my father as well, and they're also from West Philadelphia. And it was something that really took the city over for a year, which was really kind of interesting to me. But I think for me, it was a way of kind of demolishing not only just MOVE, but just the entire part of that city to kind of almost erase that space. So basically, I'm going to go back a little bit further to kind of talk to you about Powelton Village in 1978, where MOVE actually started in Philadelphia. So MOVE basically is basically like dealing with all these issues in terms of stress, and they had to deal with a lot that would kind of keep them, unable to feel safe in their space. So basically, this is their home. And one thing that I thought was fascinating about Powelton Village space is that they actually rebuilt the space in order to kind of protect themselves. And I thought that was really, really interesting. But basically, in 1978, the MOVE members had a home that basically was, that they had their headquarters in. But most of their space kind of had issues with the city because they wanted to have composting and all these things that were kind of forward thinking now. They wanted to kind of return back to a way of living that allowed you to kind of live off the land, allowed you to kind of use compost. They didn't use technology. You saw in the video that they only use fire, they only burn fire for stoves. So they were kind of a organization that wanted to kind of push a form of sustainability in the 70s. But the issues that happened were when they were trying to compost and have all these natural systems, it brought a lot of vermin and rats and things like that that were a problem for the city. So what happened in 1978 was they had a standoff with the police. It lasted over 14 months. And essentially the police after trying to evict them, they basically started pouring water into the house and trying to put tear gas in the space. They even formed a blockade to keep them from even having food transported into the house itself, almost like a war of attrition. That to me seems relatively inhumane, but that's kind of like the tactics that the police were using, almost kind of like it was in a state of war in a way. Here's some images of the aftermath of that. Caused the arrest of 9 MOVE members. There's a new documentary on HBO that recently came out, kind of showcasing them and how their story kind of went forward. 9 of them were arrested and arrested for killing a cop, but all of that is alleged and never really proven. But I think with the city and the police and the mayor all kind of conspiring in a way to kind of save the city from any blame, they convicted all 9 members of the murder of a single cop during that standoff. And this is the result of that. This is the space that now exists currently at the location, and now that memory of that place is completely gone now. So next thing I'm going to talk about is how like things kind of transformed. I mentioned earlier that MOVE was going through a lot of stress. And the way that I've begun to kind of think about space and stress and trauma is thinking about PTSD and asking myself the question of whether or not spaces can have PTSD, or like what happens to a place that has trauma, or a building or a location that undergoes trauma, and what that takes to be able to heal that space. But one thing I wanted to mention about MOVE as I move forward is these people were like non-violent, and they definitely weren't trying to cause harm in the city. And I just wanted to kind of talk about their ideology a little bit, and how they wanted to go back to nature and actually have a lifestyle that allowed for them to be self-sustaining. But basically what happened after a time, and I'm gonna go back to like the conflict, what happened on Osage. Basically after a long kind of bout of like being isolated by the city, they started building more. And that was something that I thought was interesting architecturally, right? You take a group of people living on their own, living kind of freely, but they felt increasingly more and more isolated from the city. So they built these structures to kind of keep themselves safe. They even built these steel structures at the top of the roof that you can kind of see in that image on the top right, basically to kind of protect themselves from the police and try to keep themselves from being evicted. So here's a diagram that I think is really interesting. I found doing a little bit of research about the space and how they modified the location. So this is on the right, you can kind of see 2 sections. On the top is the existing, like how they moved into the space. Like there's a porch, there's a stoop, and there's a kind of an opening that's like close to the public, right? And that's kind of like a way to, it's like a boundary between the public and private space, but it allows you to be able to converse with your friends and family, but also the community. But if you look at the bottom, on the bottom right, a lot of the space that are being fortified, and the connection between the city and MOVE began to get smaller and smaller to the point of really just complete isolation. You can see in these section kind of perspective on the left, like all the types of fortification that were used to kind of keep themselves protected from the police. And you even see like bunkers on the bottom, the basement. You have a bunker at the top of the space, and all these reinforcements that I thought were kind of fascinating architecturally. So basically, the main point that I wanted to make, and I'm going to make it real quick, was that a lot of what I wanted to research when I started thinking about Philadelphia was erasure, because this is kind of what happened exactly about 7 months after the fire. They completely wiped out that and leveled that entire space. And the space became this empty lot. And then maybe about a year later, they built these homes that were totally uncharacteristic of the space. They totally kind of castrated the stoop from the space, almost keeping them from being social. And this is how it looks today, which I thought was kind of fascinating, that after all this decay that happened, after this kind of catastrophic event, the city completely erased the memory of that event from happening. And one thing about PTSD that I wanted to kind of mention and kind of conclude with is that the only way for people to kind of heal from some event like that is to be able to have some kind of collective healing and acknowledgement of the memory. But the city didn't even apologize for this until recently. And there's been even statues that have been removed from people like Frank Rizzo, who you've seen in the video, that perpetuated a lot of the violence and stereotypes against the MOVE members. And that's kind of like exactly what happened. And I want to kind of wrap it up because I know I'm really long-winded. But basically, a lot of these kind of acts of spatial violence happen in so many different ways that it can be, it's relatively unjust. And that's why the title is Living Just Enough. You know, it's like, where was MOVE living just enough to be able to live and have a right to existing? But when competing with the city, police, and law, how do they maintain an existence that isn't controversial? And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about in terms of that form of spatial violence. I know me and Josh, I'm going to kind of segue. Me and Josh had a long conversation yesterday, just thinking about gentrification and what I was talking about with spatial violence and physical violence on a space, and how that might, how that continues today. And that's really what we wanted to talk about. And Josh, you can kind of chime in now if you want.
Yeah, I wanted to talk more about spatial violence in the sense of gentrification and how we can design spaces that can basically essentially not be gentrified. So going back to the You Will Never Understand project, which I'm gonna go to the PowerPoint. These are the slang terms, alien being what I said in the video, the red ant, artificial intelligence, and the spider. The alienated, those who have been oppressed, discriminated against, African-American citizens in Detroit specifically, or Philadelphia. Conjuring, which is the act of calling upon the alien to appear, a magical ritual performed by the alienated. So first, doing this process, I started with basically critiquing modernism. And I proposed that if architecture is to address the wants and needs and desires of the alien and the alienated that were once whitewashed in modern spaces, it must reintroduce the alien to create ecological systems and rebuild from the carcass of modernism so as to confront oppression in the architectural systems. And the way I did that was starting off with basically a what if. And that's when I started taking these iconic modern architecture elements and began to break them down to ask what if they were abandoned. I mean, will we look at it the same, or, will we just brush it off? And then that led me into wanting to understand abandonment in Detroit specifically. And so that led me to the Packer plant, which was the site for the project. The Packer plant sits in the heart of Detroit's east side between a major highway and intersection. The plant thrived during the automotive boom. However, the automotive company went out of business in the early 50s. Since the 60s, the infrastructure that housed the automakers have been left abandoned with no plans of demolition or rehabilitation. The alien began invading both at the larger scale of the factories and at the individual scale of the house due to desertion of the automotive industry and workers that survived from them. The building that was once a statue of modernism, industrialism, capitalism, and discrimination is now overtaken by the same entity that is trying to displace. The Packer plant and the community that resides around it is the effect of a dying economy and racial tension that ripple throughout the city. And one of the key images that I really wanted to highlight was the one on the left here, inside the factory where they're building the placard cars. And you notice a key thing inside of this photo, and is that there weren't any Black workers. They weren't allowed to work in the factory. They weren't allowed to live in this area because of redlining in Detroit. And once the factory went out of business, because they didn't want to, and because of the riots, white Americans started to move out of the city, and Black Americans started to move to the east and the west side and started to move around the neighborhood. However, they left the factory. They never destroyed it. So what we get is these. You get a factory that is decaying and has been decaying for since the 60s. And that we're starting to see that this was also a domino effect. When we get to the site in context, you start to see that all of these fields used to be neighborhoods. It used to be housing for the workers who used to live here. And now we're seeing that you might see one or two houses on a block. And that's because soon as the factory went out of business and the economy started to die, people just left their houses and went to go to bigger and better things or live in the suburbs. And now is to talk about my process. So to incorporate the alien on the site, one must control the desires. Conjuring is the idea of the alienated calling upon the alien to appear. The alienated does this by creating attraction spots around the site and building in order for the alien to expose itself from the underground. In the smaller physical test, the ritual of conjuring started with attracting the ant with sugar water to result in canals being built in the sand. This ideology of conjuring is derived from both ectoplasm photography that depicts an exorcism or evil spirit that is extracted from the body, and Veve symbols, which represented the astral forces descending to earth during African voodoo ceremonies. Just like ectoplasm and Veve, the alien is being extracted and exposed from the cracks of the Packard building. So the visual on the left was we did a bunch of tests of just seeing where the alien will move. So this is all just motion within the Packard plant, and it resulted on the thing on the right. And then we got to the conjuring maps, which was in the video as well, which was derived from conjuring ectoplasm and Veve symbols, and basically essentially combining them. And then for my conclusion, I'm going to leave you all with this. In this world we live in, we can only trust our instincts, our hearts, and our queens. When we are born, no one told us how hard life would actually be for us. The generation before paved the way and broke barriers for us to have a more comfortable experience. However, the world feels like it hasn't pushed forward, and we are stuck under constant scorn and surveillance. They watch us 24/7 like a guard watching an inmate. We're institutionalized to think that this is normal, to live in fear, go where we're told, and to understand why they do it. We try to build our own spaces of concealment, but they're still finding a way to gentrify and appropriate the only areas we have. We slave to get a seat at the table, taking the bare minimum to create, while also forming a culture where we can thrive. But it seems that it all goes to waste to create while also due to the oppressor. The oppressor then steals and capitalizes on the success of the space. the horrifying part of the situation is that we work like machines in order to provide for the family, but society turns the other way. They don't see us picking up the dead homies from the ground, the tears in our queen's eyes when we get added to the pile, or the constant ridicule from the oppressor. So when the time comes when we are exposed and create our own table in our skins with crowns on our heads, don't try to understand us, understand the struggle, because you will never understand how we got to this point of excellence.
Thank you guys. Both very powerful and still relevant topics. I'm really excited to get into this discussion. First, I just want to allow the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we'll just jump right into the first question. And I want to remind everyone you can leave questions in the chat down below. Okay.
Hi, I'm Catherine Chatterton, and I'm a second-year undergraduate architecture student.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Jai Bozeman. I'm a third-year undergraduate architecture student.
Good, it's good.
And then along with them too, we had two other people that haven't been able to make it. One was Nikki and Jai. She's also a fourth-year undergrad architecture student. Michelle Singer, who's actually here, who was on our panelist, kind of helped formulate the whole questionnaire as was along with me and Jared. And so Jared, if you're gonna ask the first question that we have prepared.
Yeah, so just starting off, we were wondering sort of the significance of the titles you guys chose, how they were found and how they reflect your work, as well as some of the target audience with it, seeing as Living Just Enough seems to be talking about us and coupled with talking about a lot of the history, whereas You Will Never Understand seems very directed. And sort of just speaking about what that target audience means and why you chose it like that.
I'll go ahead real quick. So Living Just Enough is actually the name of the studio that shout out to Peter McCoppy, he's on a call as well right now. But in the beginning, when we were choosing studio, the studio was really kind of talking about like listening into the city. So the song that we played to kind of get us thinking about the class and thinking about how we can see the city by listening. He's played a song by Stevie Wonder, Living Just Enough. Right? It's Just Enough, and it's like I forget the name, the title, but basically it's like Living Just Enough, basically. And what happens in the beginning of the audio is you just hear him kind of like arriving in the city. So I when I was thinking about and just kind of being in this space, Stevie Wonder's blind, but he was able to kind of conceive of a space through sound and music. So when I was thinking about trying to title the project, I just kind of kept the Living Just Enough and then added the subtitle about like spatial trauma in Philadelphia. But I couldn't really think of a better title than Living Just Enough, because I think with the MOVE members, I think that you have to ask yourself, were they living just enough, right? Because they ultimately were killed, a number of them. Whether or not justice was served, is up for debate to some people. So I just kind of kept that title. Sorry, no long-winded answer, but I wanted to make sure I gave some credit to Peter.
Yeah, and for You Would Never Understand, I mean, it was a project that I wanted to do for a very long time, since third year. And I remember we were doing like the dorm project, and we were doing housing, and we were working in this gentrified area. And I was just like, you know, that like they don't get it. Like they don't get it, especially when we were like building housing for like this. It was the prompt was for like this college or building college dorms or whatever. I was just like, they don't get it. Like we, like as architects, we're supposed to help people. Like we are servants to the community. So, you know, my biggest thing, like when I was doing this project, I was like, I don't think people are going to understand my experiences. I don't think people are going to understand, you know, how detrimental gentrification is for my community. And I was talking to Michelle, who was my professor, and we were talking about a bunch of like my experience at Pratt, my experiences at you know, different, like being in different communities. And she was just like, you should just call it, you would never understand. Because like no one's really gonna no one's gonna really understand your experiences but the people who actually experience, you know, what you've been through. So it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like flipped where like, I guess the outside world is not gonna understand what's happening, but people who look just like me are gonna understand everything that is happening. So yeah, that's how that basically came about. And it's jarring, you know, first thing people see when they saw the thesis thing and they were like, you would never understand, like who would title their thesis that, you know? So
And so to move from those, because both projects were really powerful, I remember discussing, for me, which can go for both of y'all, is kind of based off this critical expression y'all both expressed throughout your thesis to people who wouldn't understand, or to those who might not know, living on the edge or just enough. How do we begin to address the language and tonal differences within architecture to our formal space? Because you described yours very much as invasion. You know, there's an invasive space, Josh, and then for Marlon, it's an evasion, it's a clearance. And then it went from Joshua's to invasion to a clearance of that because it couldn't be sustained, but then to analytical. So how you both, it's kind of also a critique on what is appropriate when it comes to presenting something in architecture. You know, everything has to be so pristine and clear cut and clean, right? How do we address those differences in that language when we start to present, especially when doing this spatial analysis?
Can you reframe that a little bit, that last part of the question?
Yeah.
That was a loaded question, not gonna lie. I'm like, well, I do have some comments from some of it, but reframe that last part.
Because looking at each of the projects, right, is historical. One is very historical and analyzing it in that way, and the other was more so a presentation. Both of them with very gritty images, right? So the language and the tone in which y'all both presented them not really associated with what is normal in architecture, and we're talking about formal spaces, right? So based off of that, how did you begin to start to address that and know that you wanted to present it that way?
Okay. Okay, I think it's funny. I think you had seen my presentation or as part of my final years ago, but I actually struggled a lot when I was trying to figure out what I was going to make, because the studio was framed around juridical facilities or law. Like, how can we improve a juridical facility? What's a juridical problem? I had to like frame that, or frame my research around a juridical problem. And then it had a spatial component, obviously, because we study architecture. So as I was doing research, I started my research, honestly, looking at adult probation and parole in Philly, and looking at like the spectacle of people walking in and out and being in line to sign up for a parole and check in with the parole officers, And I thought that was fascinating because it's right outside of City Hall in Philadelphia, where there's a statue of Frank Rizzo, who you've seen in the video, who has like a very, he might have coded language about how he speaks about people that he opposes, but I think a lot of that was just kind of more racist. So I was looking at the city from that point of view. I was trying to find what is a juridical problem in Philadelphia. And my initial thought was adult probation and parole. Maybe I'll build a building there to discuss that. But as I started doing more research within the city, and I honestly just had a conversation with a friend and also had a conversation with my parents and my grandfather about the move bombing, which to me became a lot more pressing to discuss or interesting to discuss, because I don't think anyone knew about that kind of violence in the city, because it was completely erased. I think that for me, I struggled a lot trying to figure out, how do I make this an architectural project? Like, how do I build a thing? Do I rebuild Osage Ave? Do I rebuild the adult probation parole facility in City Hall? And then I think there was a lot of resistance, I think, at first to make a building after I found this research, because I didn't feel like the way to discuss this architecturally was by making a new thing. I wanted to talk about how a thing can be erased, kind of like the opposite, right? Like a lot of times in school, we learn how to make, we learn how to create. We're like world builders, right? We envision things to be anew. But what does that mean when those things are destroyed or erased? So for me, the problem became less about making a new facility, but like thinking about how law, the police, and like the mayor all are a part of a system that allows for this to happen, right? Like when I think about the bombing and how that affected the city, kind of without any repercussions in any way from police or the mayor or really anybody outside of some monetary assistance after they burn down your house. That was for me a lot more important to discuss. And I think the larger thing, and I think Josh mentioned earlier, was that the people don't understand. I think one thing that we have in architecture discourse is that there is sometimes there's oftentimes a lack of social understanding in space, right? There's a lot of times you might be building a brand new apartment complex or something like that in the studio, and you're kind of void of having to deal with whom actually lives there. And I wanted to kind of, I know it's a long-winded answer, but I kind of wanted to like think about the, I guess, problem of erasure. I think that's the main thing. It's kind of like the opposite of world building is erasing. But a lot of times what happens when space like that is erased, there's no reconciliation because there's no resolution, there's no resolve. And as you saw at least with the move bombing, that part of the city literally continued to decay to the point where the city wanted to buy back that space and tear down everything that they had rebuilt, after having already erased it, because they didn't want to address what they did. It's only recently that the city of Philadelphia even apologized for that bombing. That was almost 40 years ago. And the removal of statues like Frank Rizzo happened literally within the year because of Black Lives Matter. So I think that the reason that I wanted to kind of explore that or expose that is just being critical of how the city handled it, try to use the building or the bombing of a space, and even talking about their previous space in Powelton Village, like those two spaces were completely erased off the face of the map. If you walk past those things, you would never know they existed. And to me, that made more sense as a architectural project than building anew. And I know I thank Peter, thank you again. I was always thanking him for this all the time, for allowing me not to have built a thing. A lot of what I did was I made like a zine. It's like maybe 15 pages of writing, along with some visuals to show the conflict. But I think it received more attention than I thought because it wasn't a building. Like I was probably the only person in class that didn't do building, like for their final project in architecture. I was like, I don't know how it happened, but I think that the investigation of what types of spatial violence can do, you know, what they are and how they manifest themselves through all these different like systems, whether it's police, mayor, law, you know, those things are all intersecting to kind of have this architectural destruction, you know, and I'll leave it at that, you know, I'm long-winded. You guys gotta cut me off. You guys have a timer or something for me.
If you want to cut him off, Josh, answer. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like he literally said everything that I was gonna say about my project, because that's literally what happened for me. I think it just started off as, originally it was gonna be just a school. I wasn't thinking about doing, like, I really wanted to do a school that was specifically for my community. But once I started researching and once I started really diving into, like, you know, what actually happened in Detroit, like he was talking to his parents and his grandparents, and I was doing the same thing. I was talking to my mother, I was talking to my dad, who he lived throughout the riot. Essentially, he saw the riot happen. His dad was in front of the house with a shotgun, waiting for people. Like, if people tried to run into his house, like, he was a part of that. So once I started really diving into the research, really started talking to people, that's when I knew, okay, like, maybe it isn't just a space that has a program of a school. Maybe it's just, what if I just create a space in general for the community? Because I feel like, you know, we really don't, not at least in Detroit, I don't know of I can't really think of a space that is really designed for us that hasn't, I don't know of a space. Like, I can't think of one. So, and then when it came to, like, actually presenting the, because I think that was a part of your question too, if I'm not mistaken, like presenting, I'm guessing in an architectural sense, like in studio.
Yeah.
I think it was a whole thing of, I kind of wanted people to feel like they are comfortable with, because we're talking about both of us at least, we were talking about very intense subjects. So I didn't want it to come off as like, this is wrong, you're wrong for this, like, you don't understand my community, you don't get it. It's all about teaching people your experiences. And I think, for me at least, I wanted it to feel I wanted to give people something that they're used to. So, like, I kind of gave it a regular, like an architectural crit, but you kind of just, what Michelle likes to call it, decolonize it, and basically allow for people to question you, allow for people to ask questions and have a conversation. You don't want it to be something where it's just like you're lecturing in front of a bunch of people. But no disrespect to what we're doing now, but like, you don't want it to be like, you know, people are afraid to ask questions. And I think it was really productive in the sense of, like, you know, people still hit me up saying that it's helped them, or they read more into, like, the Detroit riots, or they read into gentrification. So, yeah.
Okay, and then to go off of, those are good answers, but then realizing, going off of both of those, the lack of documentation when it comes to certain subjects, right? So y'all both found documentation, but from an outside sense, right? From not what was.
Right.
So, for instance, when fires happen, especially in red line cities, we watched in one of my classes, we watched a video about how the fire chiefs, many of them don't go to that area as often as they do, or they don't really, is a call, but it's not a response for them.
Right.
Things are left to decay and to burn and to perish, right? And so also within the Packer plant, when these people started leaving and that started to become a divested area, like the leaving of it to perish. So how did y'all begin to, so is this, were these the beginnings of, especially through personal research, a type of documentation for yourself combined with like, you know, what you were able to find? Or?
Yeah, I think it was both. I think a part of it was, I didn't know much about the Packer plant. I knew of the Packer plant. I didn't really know much of the history. Crazy enough, talking to family, my great grandfather worked at the Packer plant, and this was like when they were like on the verge of like financial crisis. So they needed workers. So, but yeah, it was mostly a thing of when I was looking for research, when I was researching this topic, I found a lot of old footage, what you guys seen in the film. I found a lot of old footage about the Detroit riots and about redlining, about, there was a hospital, I don't want to put the link in there, but there's a hospital in Detroit that was specifically for African Americans. It was built by African American doctors because there's a hospital in the middle of the city. They refused to let African Americans into the hospital. They refused to take care for these people, for Black people. So they built a hospital. But, you know, researching that and then talking to family and, you know, a lot of the stuff that you heard in the film was first person experiences. A lot of that stuff I didn't go research. For sure the redlining, but like a lot of the experiences when I was talking about the Detroit riots or when I brought it up in the third part of the film, like was all first person. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, I'll chime in real quick too. I think like Josh, I think my research was deeply personal once because of the city, but it became a lot more real once I found out that my grandfather knew some of the movement members personally. And I think a lot of the people on Osage Ave knew their fate. I think one thing that my grandfather said to me that I thought was pretty shocking was like maybe a few days prior to the standoff, one of the members was at the house. And it was they used to sell watermelons and things in the city, and they used to do things for the neighborhood, like to clean cars, they would fix things, they would sell fruits and things like that to move members. But I remember my grandfather letting me know that one of the members said that they're going to go back to the house and they're going to burn. Like that was like something that they knew was their fate. You know, there was no other, way that they would mediate between the city. So for me, I thought, one, that's the one thing I thought was deeply personal. Second, real quick, I'll mention is that you mentioned redlining and the crafting of space. Like all these neighborhoods in all cities are not by accident, right? You know, Black people living in one neighborhood, like people of Latin descent living in another, people of European descent living in another they're all by design, right? You know, we are world builders, and the people that do that are planners and architects and stuff. So for me, when I was studying Osage Ave, obviously that was not obviously, but I think it's obviously because I'm so comfy right now, but it was pretty much like all Black town or Black part of the town, and also Black homeowners as well. So it wasn't just like people renting, there are people that own these spaces. And I find it very hard to believe that something like that would have happened in like Fishtown or somewhere where, the demographics are different. I can't even imagine that. It's almost like the insurrection, right? You can't even imagine that if the faces of those people were a little bit different, right? So I think that like when you think about redlining in relation to our projects, and just to kind of bring it full circle, like on the Osage Ave bombing, the fire department was literally present, the police were literally present, but they allowed it to burn for 3 hours, destroying multiple homes. Like literally not even caring about the residents that they said would be able to go back to their homes. So I think I answered some of those things, but those are the things that I guess I was compelled to talk about after the question. And I yield my time.
Catherine, I think you had a question that sort of talks to Paul's question in the chat as well.
Yeah, so in the chat, Paul asked, I wanted to ask a little bit more about y'all's conversation on anti-gentrification architecture and how are you thinking about that? And I think for me, when hearing both of your projects, I was thinking about the idea of double consciousness and the internal conflict that comes with trying to remain true to yourself and to your culture while also kind of seeing yourself and conforming to this like dominant white society. And so how does seeing yourself through this veil of double consciousness and through a racialized white lens, you know, alter your spatial experience where the surveillance and policing enacted upon you kind of becomes a part of you? And how can we start to reverse that with architecture and, you know, the built environment?
I can start off real quick. It's funny because me and Josh last night, we were probably on a call for like an hour and a half just talking about the topic, and we did talk about it.
Literally.
We just literally, your question is literally something we spoke about. We were thinking about how, for us, moving around in space, like outside of my house, and not even just like, not just anywhere really, you can be in your home. Like my body can be violated. You know, if I walk down the street, I live in Brooklyn, I live fairly close to projects, but I live in a gentrifying part of the city. Like it's still happening, but you see mobile police, and then you'll see like literally on the same block, there's a mobile police station which doesn't normally exist. You wouldn't see that in Williamsburg, you wouldn't see that in Harlem or Manhattan. You see it in Brooklyn. But literally on the opposite corner, there's like a mac and cheese spot opening up, but it's like totally has nothing to do with the city, and I'm pretty sure it's not a business owner that is from Brooklyn, right? But like for us, moving around space is dangerous, you know. So it's a very potent thought that I have like every single day. And I think one thing that me and Josh talked about last night was being able to tell these stories to allow, you know, our other classmates that don't maybe have that way of thinking to know now, to like be aware that there are people in society that think that about themselves moving through space as you know, having that double consciousness. Like I'm always aware of my blackness or my hair, you know, going to meetings, site visits, you know, all that. I'm very much aware of that, you know. It's like and so I really feel that question that should be going right now, but it is a lot about, for me, like if you're talking about anti-gentrifying architecture, it begins first with talking about the history of space, you know, and the communities where that gentrifying is actually happening. So I think for me, when I think about my classmates, some may even come from, you know, a lot of different countries that may not even have any understanding of America outside of its black and whiteness. But there are intricate details about our lives that, you know, are, you know, you don't have to study as an architecture student. You're studying aesthetics, studying design, you're studying structures. You know, you're not really thinking about social structures. How does my building affect the social structure? So I think being able to have these discussions are kind of being able to kind of teach why an anti-gentrification like way of thinking even matters, right? Yeah, I'll leave it at that now.
I mean, and also respecting culture. I mean, what we see in Harlem is a blatant disrespect to culture, because everybody in this room, I mean, majority of us in this room know the history of Harlem in the sense of like it being literally the Black Hollywood at one point. So I think I think it's just with, and a method would definitely be respecting the culture, but also having the community band together. I think that's one of the biggest things with my project was, you know, we're building something for the community, but at the end, like when it's all built and it's a service for the community, the community has to protect it just as much as the alien has to protect it. So I think it's just that's another form of anti-gentrification, is the community coming together and saying, no, like you're not gonna come in our neighborhoods and you're not gonna destroy what we built. And also we're not gonna support anything that you're doing if it's not gonna help us in the long run. So yeah.
Yeah, and just real quick too, like from a practical point of view, I think, and there's really not very much. From a practical point of view, I think as people that make these worlds, you know, there's no incentive to even to maintain a community after building a new thing, right? When I'm in Brooklyn, I see all these new apartment buildings coming up, but there's nothing that is even incentivizing those spaces to maybe hire people in the neighborhood so they could stay. You know, there are things that are working against us. There are obvious structures in place that kind of allow for gentrification to happen pretty easily, you know, because the flip side of that is that, oh, we're building this apartment or building this Whole Foods or we're building this mac and cheese spot on my corner, I hate it, to revitalize the space. But it's almost like, where was that investment in space prior to demographics from outside moving in, right? So it's like, I think for one thing that I think me and Josh are really talked about is that there is no respect of culture, right? Like these are cultural spaces that, you know, can become erased through literal violence or, you know, this very methodic, you know, acquisition of space, and then, you know, the whole demographic changes. You know, that's one side of the coin, but the other side of the coin is that there's no real like political incentive for people to build. I remember doing a project in Camden, New Jersey. This is like years ago before I even started grad school. But a lot of what a project that I was working on with the city of Camden was to figure out ways to incentivize developers to empower the community, but without any kind of any way to empower communities financially. After you start building all these new fancy things, it's going to inevitably push everybody out. So I think the one side of things, we need to continue to bring these topics up in architectural discourse. So I don't think they were happening as much. I think my class with Peter was one of them, but I think having these types of conversations are definitely the beginning of trying to address any type of anti-gentrifying architecture.
Okay, so I have a question. Just speaking off of respecting cultural spaces, our spaces, and having to just find this balance between, like you said, crafting these spaces and then coming together as a community. I just was wondering, how do we continue to operate underground while continuing to create Black spaces for the Black body, but to also balance being heard? Because as was noted in the film and with other things, operating underground went from, you know, Black Panther Party to now we're in recent times BLM. And a lot of the times, especially in the Black community, there's a frustration expressed about, oh, notable things happen, and then all of a sudden, nobody cares anymore. And so it's like we have to, as we move through time, these movements had to be watered down in order to be palpable to who we're trying to express our sentiments to. So like I said, how do we balance creating our own spaces, making sure that we preserve our culture and our stories, while also trying to communicate these stories without them being taken advantage of?
That's such a great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Nothing more clear to you, but I definitely have some thoughts on it. All right, cool. I'm just gonna go for it.
Yeah.
I think that like the question isn't really good, because I do feel like there is like it's almost like a fatigue that happens when something happens, right? Like talking about like anytime somebody gets murdered by the police, or there's any type of like issue there's a fatigue that happens and no one cares, no one even remembers. You know, like people act like there's oftentimes a sentiment, I think, that Black Lives Matter has only existed for like since last April, right? But it's an organization that's been around for a long time. We've been talking about things relating to Black lives and like any types of reform for a very long time. But I don't really feel I don't feel like I have to water down my message any longer. I think that that's one thing that I used to think I needed to do. I need to water things down so they seem soft. And, you know, like here's, you know, just kind of like spoon feeding them the information, and that'll probably keep me from, it'll probably make me omit things that'll make them feel uncomfortable, right? And I think one thing that Josh mentioned about like decolonizing stories, you know, that means literally telling it how it is, telling the truth, right? Like telling the truth of an event or what I think about reform, all that. I think even when I decided to present, I thought about that. Like, you know, I don't always want, you know, my existence or what I talk about to be about trauma, right? Like, I think Black culture is also a very resilient and happy culture. Like, we do a lot of fun things. You know, not my practice and things that I make, I don't think will always be so like these like sad, traumatic stories. But if I am going to talk about something that's traumatic, I'm going to tell you what it is. Because now, if I begin to water my story down, then I'm still colonized myself. You know, I'm still trying to speak in their language, but I don't have to speak in their language any longer. You know, because I'm empowering myself. And if I tell you a story that, you know, might give you more information to, you know, be, I guess, more aware in society, or more aware as an architect, or more aware as an architecture student, or whatever, you know, that's on them. I kind of let the story speak for itself, because I don't think we need to water it down. If we water it down, then it allows our stories to continue to be, you know, forgotten. You know, and I'm not about being nice about our stories, because I don't think there was anything nice about any of those events. So
it's okay to tell the full truth, nothing but the truth. Nobody can take the truth away from you.
Yeah.
Those are some good answers. Thank you. And now, since we do have the questions in the chat, I would like to ask if either Muhammad or Akil would either one like to present, like ask the question themselves.
I'll ask the question. So my question was that, you know, you both mentioned spatial violence. That's like the perfect way to like describe gentrification, because violence is not just something that's, you know, tangible, that you get stabbed or something, or you get put in prison. My question was, design can't solve everything. So like in this case, like in the near future, does the architect become more of a policymaker, or like someone that's more involved in politics, or and also like what happens when the policy is out of design's reach?
That's a great question right there. Really, really good question. I think that I'm just gonna be brief. I think the reason I use spatial violence, honestly, when I started thinking about the project years ago, it was the only way that I could talk about something or it was the only way I thought I could talk about the project and, you know, still be, you know, still get credit for doing the project, as if I kind of make it more about it's violent, but it's space. And I think they're qualities that, you know, are an easy way to describe what's happening. I think mine's a little more literal. I think when you're talking about gentrification, it's a lot more subtle. But it doesn't mean that they're less violent to me, right? So that's kind of why I use the term violence for space. And me and Josh talked about this last night with gentrification, because they're very aggressive. They're very aggressive ways to either displace, erase, or literally like destroy. You know, all that's violent to me.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can't really ignore it. Like at least for me, when talking about Detroit, spatial violence is like urban decay. I feel like is a spatial violence, especially when you're leaving something that we're talking about, what, 3.5 million square feet. You're leaving that in the middle, in the middle of a neighborhood, and just watching it crumble. But it was one of those, I guess, as to answer your question, for architects, I feel like in this situation, for sure, it kind of, like you couldn't mask this, like you had to address it. And I feel like with situations like this, or situations that are similar to this, such as like gentrification, you kind of have to address it as an architect. That makes sense.
Yeah, and just to jump into, I don't think I answered the second part of the question about policy and what that means for us as designers. I think one thing that we can't escape is that everything is political, right? Like, I mean, that's
right.
More personal too, but there is nothing in our world that doesn't have anything to do with politics. So even as a designer, I think that we do have responsibility to be engaged in those conversations, because we are, you know, we create these spaces, you know, like we can be a part of it or be complicit in that violence, right? I might work at a studio and, you know, we're doing this project and I live in Bed-Stuy, right? You know, still mostly gentrified in many places, but still on the cusp of being transformed, right? Like I could be complicit in at least the making of that. And I don't feel like that is, obviously it's easier said than done. And I can't participate in this project and then I get fired, right? But I do think you can still be critical about that as a designer, or even with your principal, whomever you're working with. I think we have to be engaged in that, because I remember reading once, I forget whom it was, but they were talking about apolitical architecture, and it was a paper or something, and I was like, what about architecture is not political, or what about life isn't political in our world? So I think that I think we do need to. I think policy is one way, but being able to be critical of all aspects of what we do are essential for the profession to grow. Yeah, because I do think I think the last part of your question, like when policy is out of design's reach, that's still something I'm still figuring out today. I think I want to be able to practice architecture in a way that I get to say something, or I get to help save, or not save that's a terrible word, help serve. I never like to use save or help in any way. So we're always serving, I think Josh mentioned earlier. But like as a servant to people, it's like, how can I serve without being a complicit part of those issues? And yeah, because I don't believe in architectural determinism, right? I don't feel like you can change society through building, but I do think that we can be critical about what we do. So because we have such close communication with planners and all these other folk that, you know, help decide how space is crafted.
And Akil, do you want to say your question? Or do you want us to say it?
Hey, Jai already kind of like asked the question that I was asking, but I guess you guys can talk about it more in depth, or I can explain my question more in depth. But the question is, with Move, understanding the truth about the system, do you guys think integrating understanding the system to raise consciousness along with our history of ways of living will allow us to create societies free or limited from confinement and destruction. And to add on to that, it's similar to like when you start to understand how the system works and how things maneuver, sometimes things don't really work in our favor because it's kind of like the sad truth, but also to we know what we're capable of doing in our history as we've seen throughout time, especially with Black Panther as like the system would try to destruct us. Do you think there's a way like we can create a balance of like understanding a system along with like integrating our history of ways of living? So then that way we can create our own, like I would call it like emerging unison areas as to where that'll help us strive in isolated conditions.
I'm just gonna hop in. I think some of the question about like the truth and move, trying to understand what their truth is. For me, that was interesting because their truth really is kind of more about like figuring out how to live off the land in a city. I mean, it's funny because a lot of those concepts are like being talked about now. Like, how do we have all these urban farms, all this, these green roofs, and like all these things that are actually trying to integrate parts of, like of the natural world, in our cities. But I think back then, obviously, like composting and practicing stuff like that in the city was like crazy in 1970, 1978. People weren't even thinking that much about trying to have a system of living that is, connected to the land, right? But that's like one part of that, part of your question. But I do think, like, let me just read the question one more time. I do think that one thing about Move that I thought was interesting is that their truth about like knowing how the city was kind of against them in ways that were a little invisible to the naked eye. A lot of the people from Move were either incarcerated before or trying to find themselves, but they already knew how the system could kind of break them down or like completely throw them in prison. They just become a body that is part of a system of like of for-profit prisons. All these things that we talk about. But I do think there needs to be a continued revealing of what those systems are. Like people, at least in school, I don't think I had conversations about like mass incarceration very much in architecture school. So like if there is a way to heighten awareness about these things, maybe people will care more, which I think happened a little bit. And remember in May and April, everybody was on Instagram, like all the posts that were talking about like dismantling and with like defunding the police or police reform, and all these people are getting much more aware, which I think is a huge key for us to figure out a way to feel like we can have some autonomy as a people, but I think we have to still continue to like uncover and like figure out how the system really is affecting me. Because I think people can say, oh, the system's messing me up, or like a system is beating me down or it's holding me down. But there are very real, there are very real laws, very real government tactics that are defining these things. So it is a system. It's very much organized. So I think it's important to want to learn, raise awareness, raise consciousness, and then keep us from being destroyed or confined. That's to kind of look at what you're asking to go.
Yeah, I think that you mentioned a key thing, which is like consistency, because like consistency along with progression, like we can learn from Move, because I actually didn't know anything about that. We can learn from that and utilize it and start, I guess, doing a little more acts of implementing, because now we're in a new age or a new realm, like we're in 2020. So I think like with the use of like consistency along with utilization, understanding that past could actually lead to like more progression.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that one thing I do want to mention too is that the reason that I thought this project or the study was so interesting is because the city and MOVE were at complete odds, right? But there needed to be some type of resolution that never really happened. There is a system in which you have to resolve things. That it's not like MOVE was completely innocent, right? Like I do have to say that. I don't think there's no justification of lost life, but there is a real system that they must, operate within. We're all part of a society, and it's like that part of like understanding how to deal with law and like understanding it, understanding law in a way to operate. Like I think it's super important, to be able to get that like self-sustaining way for sure.
All right, I appreciate your answer.
I appreciate you too, Ko. Thank you.
Okay, so I have a question for Joshua specifically.
Okay.
I want to start with the definitions of horror and terror. And so horror is an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. So in my eyes, horror is experienced. And terror is a tool. It's the use of terrorism to intimidate people, especially for political reasons. And as was said in Marlon's, the video that you showed, us being described as terrorists, or the group MOVE being described as terrorists, or just the fact of alien versus alienated. So the relationship between, like I just said, the alien and the alienated is one of the ways that you framed your project. And you mentioned conjuring in this sense of conjuring being the act of calling upon the alien to appear, or a magical ritual performed by the alienated. And so this put me in the mind of the horror film, The Conjuring, and the matter of body possession. So when considering the horror subjected to the Black body and the terror experienced as a Black body, how has territory conditioned the behavioral response of the Black body through the cultural white lens of horror and terror?
Wait, slow down the last part.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna say it again. Okay, so when considering the horrors subjected to the Black body and the terror experienced as a Black body, how has territory conditioned the behavioral response of the Black body through the cultural white lens of horror and terror? I'm gonna put it in the chat too.
Yeah, please. Yeah. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
How does territory condition? Oh, okay. Using the behavioral response. Sorry, I'm reading your question. I'm trying to answer it right. It was like confusing a little bit in some parts. Okay. I'm gonna see if I can try to answer this. So I guess and correct me if I mess up or anything, or like if I'm not answering your question. So are you saying like sorry, I'm trying to get this right. So are you asking me to explain the horrors or the terrors that has been subjected to the Black body? That's what you're trying to that's the question you're trying to ask me?
It's so funny because when we were discussing, because
like
pausing the questions, I was having a hard time myself trying to exactly how to configure horror and terror. So which is why I started off with the definitions. But it's like, so horror as experience and terror as a tool. So it's more talking about the conditions, the spatial conditions, and how through maybe even like framing it through media in the way that you did your film, through horror and terror of the cultural white lens, how has that caused the response of the Black body through terror and how we respond to our territories?
Oh, I think a lot of it has to do with, I mean, when you look at media, right? When you look at TV or you look at a story about us, it's never at all the full truth, or they're not telling the full story. See, I'm trying to, how can I say this? With my film and with my film and what I was trying to get at is like, see, I'm trying to see how I can organize it. I guess like what the tactics that's used in the media, right? They put out specific images on us, and people, like, they put out images of us that aren't any of our characteristics. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but see, this is a really difficult question. This is a good question, but it's,
We can always circle back.
no.
It is a good
because I'm really trying to like organize it. I might have to. I will answer that question. Let me get back to it. I will answer that question. I promise.
Can I jump in real quick? Just to, because I think the last part of the phrasing of the question.
That last part is where I'm trying to like. I'm like, yeah.
I'm like, am I just not like able to comprehend like your level of intelligence? I'm like, yo, like, but it's such a, like, the last part of the question, like, how has territory conditioned the behavioral response to the Black body through the cultural white lens of horror and terror? I'm like, oh, first of all, I just want to chime in and say, I like how you use terror and territory. I don't think I've ever actually made that connection until like literally just now, like terror and territory. So like for me, that also helps to like frame a lot of this like architecturally, right? Just like a lot of our spaces are terrorized like pretty intensely by bodies of people that are supposed to protect. So like it's like that terror just bleeds into our territories. It's like, where is our territory? It's like it doesn't even exist. Like,
but I think it. I'm sorry.
You go ahead, yeah, like that.
No, but I think that's the thing. Like, it's good that, and it's, thank you for both of you guys, because he just made that connection and it clicked in my head. So like, what I was thinking is just like what these territories are designed to terrify us, like in a sense of, even when we're talking about original redlining, right? With redlining, we see that like they have specific places mapped out for us, and those places are where the police at, where they surveillance us, and it's specifically designed that way as a tactic to scare us, and as a tactic to take our bodies, like in a sense of like imprisonment. And I feel like, you also talked about that you and from that standpoint, it's just like, where do we, I got know that I'm gonna leave it at that, and then I'm gonna come back to it. But starting there, yeah, it's just like these spaces are designed to terrorize us. These spaces are designed to. You're muted, Marlon.
I'm literally like reading over the question because I just love the sequence, like sonically when you just say it. But I think I'm just going to raise one question because I get most of the question except for the last bit. You said, how has territory conditioned the behavioral response of the Black body through the cultural white lens of horror and terror? So I think that last part, it makes me think, are you asking about how, like, what is the behavioral response of the Black body having undergone those terror and horror, I guess through their lens, like where, like that's kind of, is that the question? Like how am I, like how is me as a body that is Black, right? Like how's my behavior changed? I think just simply, I think you mentioned a little earlier, like, navigating through space as a Black person or a person of African descent, it's kind of like I wear my existence on my sleeve. So I constantly, you mentioned a double consciousness. I have to always be aware of myself. I have to constantly be aware of my Blackness everywhere I go, because I know that it could be, I could be terrorizing looking to somebody because, the way Josh was mentioning on the media always kind of like paints a picture of us as terrorists, right? That was mentioned also on the film. But, when I think about, existence as a Black body, I often think it's so obscure and almost absurd that after having centuries of terror, like either from like literal displacing of a whole group of people to another space, like literal, like all the violence that's happened in this country. It's so absurd to me that, we're oftentimes looked at as the terrorizing people. Like we're the most dangerous people in the country, right? Like if you looked at, if you saw Judas the Messiah, like they thought that was like such a threat, right, to the fabric of the country, right? So like when I think about myself as a Black body moving through space, the thing that I have to do to protect myself is look at I have to be aware of how people see me, like through their lens, like, so that's how, and last part of the question, I think that's what you were saying, is that I have to modify how I move through space because I'm constantly aware of how other people might see me. When I walk outside in Brooklyn, I look like everybody around here. I live in Bed-Stuy. They have no idea that I went to grad school. They have no idea about anything about my existence. But I have to be constantly aware of that.
Yeah, it's subconscious though. It's not a thing that like you're actively thinking about sometimes. It kind of just, you kind of just feel it. That's another thing. It's one of those things of like moving around space, like subconsciously, like it's weird to explain. Like you kind of already have to gear yourself up to move in a space differently, especially like, I don't know, I think the perfect example of it is, like me coming to Pratt. Like I have to move differently at Pratt versus me moving differently with, going to school in Detroit or going to high school in Detroit. Like it's a different space, and I don't know, it's kind of like you're subconsciously in this awkward position. I don't know how to really verbally explain it, but your body just knows that you have to move a certain way, or you have to talk a certain way, or you have to. So yeah.
So, cause like to go off of what you were just saying about like going to, let's say, attending Pratt, and the conversation of creating these hubs within the bigger system, and just having to look, because like there was just a conversation like the horror film and the terror and terrorism and territory,
right?
And then like I said, the relationship between alien and alienated, it's just like body possession. So in a sense, like you said, that subconscious switch of, it's not even, I don't want to say trained because that sounds very animalistic, but in a sense we were groomed.
Oh yeah.
By this white lens, or from the other people, to flip that switch. So in a sense, it's not even like that in itself could be body possession.
Right.
Even
I think
Right. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, continue your question. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I'm just talking at this point, but
No.
but it's just like we do switch it, but it's not. Did we? It's not by choice. It to a certain degree, it's not by choice.
It's not at all by choice. Like, I think it's just like, for me, especially coming into this, going to a PWI and coming into this space, it was definitely a thing where you kind of, like, culturally, people aren't going to understand unless they're a part of that community, right? So it's just like you have to, like you say, you're kind of groomed into thinking that you have to be this certain way. And I think it's a part of it for me is like, and this is one of my grievances when I was coming in first semester, is you don't want to be that stereotype of what they think of you. So you try to like shift and not do something, like you try to shift and not be that, but then you're not being yourself. And then now it's weird when you're like, you know, when you do find your community, and it's a whole nother thing. But it's, you know, it's one of those things where, like I said, it's subconsciously, like you really just don't want to, like you want to be the best especially at a PWI, you want to be the best representation of your community. So I hope that answered your question. That was a really good question.
Yeah.
We're here for conversation, if anything. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you both for those amazing answers. Kind of continuing this conversation about like thinking about language. One of the things that we talked about is continually seeing the prefix re and all these different words like revolution and reparations, and you know, with it meaning back and forth again, we're thinking about kind of these cycles of perpetuated violence and continual denial of wealth, and you know, less access to opportunity. And so how do you think that we can start to use like architecture and design to create spaces that kind of support people who have been victims of this like pipeline and the incarceration system, and how can we use it to start breaking down these cycles?
That's a good question. I think I mentioned earlier that I don't necessarily believe in architectural like determinism. Kind of like, you know, you all probably are familiar about like where would I go, and like slum clearing and trying to, you know, change people's way of life and existence through a building. But I think there are just so many other aspects of life that also need to be connected, right? Like I need to be able to have a job. I need to be able to have shelter. Well, that's like the architecture point. Like there needs to be like a social revolution, right? Like that can, like when you say revolution, it has to be like very real. You know, it's not just about, you know, not just about space. It's a whole change, like a whole like change in our way of life. So like for me, the way, at least this is just personal, like the way that I feel like at least I'm trying to help change, or you know, help try to like help us to kind of manifest ourselves, like change our destiny, like is through like conversations like these, or architectural discourse. Like how can we get people that look like us, like more of us here, like more and more and more, to kind of be able to continue to envision societies that are our own, you know, because I don't think that a lot of us don't have the tools and don't even know of them. So it's like, if we can, like my personal way of trying to, you know, figure out a way to resolve these issues is to help like have these conversations and teach and expose what we do to the rest of our community. Because I do think it is a loaded question to you know, like how can we, I think it's a relevant question, like how can we, you know, continue this continue revolution. You know, I think there are cool ways, like you think about the Panthers and like all these, like either having spaces that are empowering us through food or learning or music or whatever. But it's almost like where do we even have the capital for that? You know, it's like we have it within our communities, but it's like we you already know how it is. It's very hard to get a whole bunch of Black people to invest in one space. You know what I mean? It's very difficult. 9 times out of 10, probably because it's like, how can I put in money to fund a new housing project or a new community center when I'm still struggling to feed my family? So I think that that's why I think we have to, we're world builders. I keep saying that, and so we have to be at the forefront of our communities, trying to envision what we want our communities to look like. But we still, I like the question from before about policy and stuff, because those are the things that will make that stuff stick. Because if we make a new community center that is super dope and like has all these classes and all these empowering activities, a lot of that won't persist very long. Kind of like we think about the Panthers and stuff like that. Like it can easily be dismantled because we don't have any. It's like we have power. We have lots of political power, and I think we've seen that through the last election and what we're doing with like Black Lives Matter and a lot of that. And just the effect that it has on the globe. We've noticed a lot of protests all over the planet, a lot more than I've seen over the last 10 years of my life. So I think that if we can, figure out a way to be affecting policy in some ways, so those things can stick, is the only way we can really make those revolutions really persist over time. But we have to. That's why I think you can't have an architecture career void of politics if you really care about people. If you really care about that revolution, you can't be a spectator on the sideline. It kind of makes you complicit, right? And it makes you accept an active member of that. So that's kind of I might have went on a tangent there, but those are kind of my thoughts about sustaining revolution. Because it is about a complete transformation of living. That's like when I think about the word revolution, it is like a complete transformation. That's why I'm very much for like defunding police and all. Like I'm not really about reform. There's a lot of reform there's been a lot of reform over the course of the nation's history, whether it's police or reforms to amendments and all these things. But without a dismantling of a thing, revolution will not occur. That's kind of maybe that was kind of dark, but that's kind of my thoughts on that.
No, I kind of agree.
Yeah, right. Like,
I guess to jump in just real quick without the which I was going to mention afterwards, but I'm glad Marley brought up just the word care, which I've been talking about a lot in studio, and it's kind of how do you begin to think of this as care? Because for Joshua's and Marlon's, both of y'all presenting the work in such personal, deep ways, that's starting to be a form of care in design and thought, right? And so the point of us to design is for it to be safe. Architecture is supposed to be safe. When it comes to like stripped down, it's supposed to get the people in the building out, right? Get them out in an all safe manner. And these spaces weren't safe. So how would you say is a real form of care? I would say both of y'all projects are, but when it becomes archival, I guess, would it just be archival as a form of care? Would these spaces have like, for example, the Black Panther Party, these little grassroots organizations, like those form of care, how does that become like amplified? Like what is that for y'all?
I feel like a good form of care is just being selfless in general. Like throughout this whole project, this wasn't a thing where it's just like, I'm not just telling my truth, I'm telling everybody who's lived my experience's truth. Like that was the whole thing about this thing, about the project. It wasn't, and I think that is in itself is a form of care when you can do something selfless and do something out of the kindness of your heart, or do something when you're just to better your people. I think that in itself is care. Like, but that's what we're supposed to do as architects. We're supposed to be selfless and we're supposed to be serving the public, but some architects are very, you know how it is.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a an interesting way to begin to start thinking about like why it's important to talk about these things. It's like I had a conversation with a few other professors about not always thinking about trauma as like our point of departure when it comes to like being in an academic setting, right? But when you think or you ask like how does this like what does care mean? Like what's the architecture of care, right? I think a lot of that has to do with being a witness, right? And that for me, at least for my project, it was about like being a witness to the things that have happened and then sharing that. And I think you also mentioned earlier about PTSD, like PTSD and generational trauma. And I was doing research, like this is after the project now, because I've been trying to like really sharpen up the research and writing. And PTSD was one of the things that was talked about. Like, I think I found a reading that had a great analogy about space and trauma in relation to people, right? So if we are able to bear witness and then share, then you have like this ability to have a collective memory around the thing to heal. It's like, I didn't show it, I kind of just stopped my presentation, but there are images of like September 11th, right? Like living in New York or living around New York, there was like a collective, it's super traumatic, but there was a collective effort to bear witness to the thing, to acknowledge it as an event, because a lot of times when you have PTSD, you don't really acknowledge and you try to compartmentalize and you don't resolve. But for me, when it comes to telling these types of stories, you bear witness and share. We acknowledge the pain, and then collectively we can begin to I guess resolve that generational trauma. Because without it, there's no way to move forward if we don't acknowledge a lot of these traumas. So that's kind of why I think. And before Peter left, Peter did, but he was in his studio. A lot of what he used to talk about, like his main point of departure for the studio and listening, was to be able to bear witness. So I think a lot of the reason why I think I was compelled, and Josh too, is probably to share, because I think that being able to expose these things are a way or an odd way of healing, right? It's also like how psychologists study PTSD, like the way a lot of people heal from war. Like think about Vietnam versus World War II. Like World War II, all the soldiers came home after the war. It was like this glorification of the hero, and you don't really see too much PTSD with World War II heroes because it was a collective effort to not compartmentalize that stuff. It's like, it happened, but it was for the greater good for America. You think about the Vietnam War, though. In the Vietnam War is the reason why PTSD even is a word, right? Is even a disorder. It's because people were coming back home from war like by themselves, and then you already knew the state of the country was also like really anti-war at the time. And there was like, you would come home and people look at you like you're a baby killer, so all the traumas that you had abroad continue at home, and there's no collective healing. That's why PTSD was so crazy there. And I'm also, I guess, making that analogy with like generational trauma here, right? Like where there hasn't been very much reconciliation or resolve in any of the atrocities that have happened in the Black community. Therefore, I think a lot of that PTSD and generational trauma continues today. And, why we got to tell the stories.
Side note, talking about PTSD, and this is just a side note, this is like a tangent. I was watching this video, and it was it was a prank video where one person will run down the stairs, and then people will follow them running, and then they'll run into campus, and then it'll be like collectively a bunch of people just running together, and then people be like, okay, why are we running? Like that in itself is like, that's PTSD. That's, generational trauma. Like why, like not even questioning the fact that we're running or why we're running. We're just running because we think that there's danger. Like not even asking questions. I don't know. That video, when he was talking about that video came into my head.
Yeah, I think that's so real. I think I mean, I think the conversation can be much open to anybody if y'all want to chime in if they want, but I definitely agree that a lot of those, it goes back to what we talked about before about conjuring, right? And like it's almost like the possession is not necessarily, it is a conditioning, but it's really conditioning for survival, right? Like when I see somebody running, I'm not looking the other way to see where they're running from. I'm running to survive. And I think, those traumas persist today because of that type of PTSD. Some of it is obviously some of it is taught, right? Like not that we're trained, but definitely my mom or dad was probably like, yo, like you see something happening, you run, or you talk to the police this way. You operate, you learn how to move your body space so you can survive. And it's like it's almost like that double consciousness and like that form of possession. I like that. I'm taking so many notes down, like care, like the architecture of care, Sydney. That's like my new shit right there. I'll make sure I like always give you credit for that.
I was about to say footnotes.
Huh?
Footnotes, credit.
Oh, is that yes, of course. I will.
Oh, okay.
Will definitely be Sydney King, and yeah, or you just write it, and we'll put that into my stuff anyway.
But just I think because of those themes, all of us able to even come up with these questions, be able to perceive your projects as such, So I think y'all touched on, I'm proud of the big brain people. They touched on a lot of good things that y'all talking about. I'm glad y'all got answers too. Not got answers, but y'all have thought about it too, because it's of a collective. It's a collective thought. It's a collective experience, even though we're different experiences, coming from different places, especially places like Philly and Detroit,
Yeah, those experiences aren't isolated, right? I do think that, I know we mentioned about all this kind of collectiveness, like all of the, literally just having this discussion, we could probably write a book right now about PTSD and architecture and spatial trauma and the architecture of care, like right now. But that happens from this discussion and all of our mental capacities coming together. And that to me is the essence of why we're here, and why a lot of this, I think, needs to continue within the discourse at Pratt, if I'm just being blunt.
Yeah, just sort of echoing Sid's praise, thank you, Marlon and Joshua, for all this, and also snapping for everybody who asked questions. And also Catherine and Jai, you guys are just so brilliant. And Catherine, I think you've been in architecture school for 1.5 years. That's ridiculous. That's awesome. But yes, I'm Michelle. I'm in my 4th year. I have a question. I know we're getting towards the end, but so Joshua, you deconstructed the standard thesis presentation into a film, right? And as a medium, film is both more accessible, but also it's more of a narrative than a traditional crit would be. You took on your own voice completely. We heard your voice in it. So my question is, how can we continue to share our own personal narratives of architecture in a way that's accessible? And how can we deconstruct the pre-existing boundaries within the institution of Pratt, and architecture schools as a whole? And I can paste that on the chat if you want.
Yeah, no, I think the whole thing is, with deconstructing crits and everything, is just telling your truth. I think the whole film was the car, but it was everything that I was talking about was because of either I knew somebody who went through it or I was going through it myself. I think that's the first step of deconstructing the crit, is not looking at your presentation in the sense of, this is my process, this is how I did it, these are my drawings. I used grasshopper. Like, I think it's just a thing of like actually truly speaking about your experiences. How do you want people to experience your space? Using different mediums. Film is one medium. I know people who use paintings instead of actual drawings. They use literal paintings. If you guys know of Alejandra and Susanna, they used actual paintings for their drawings to tell the story about oppression. So I think that's the main thing, is just like understanding that like it's okay, you can use different mediums, and actually using different mediums will help you get to a wider audience. I know with my film, like not a lot of people who knew about architecture still saw the film and still understood my experience. So I think that's a important tool to have in your toolbox. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
So there was for Joshua, there was it's sort of like a deep dive into the ant analogy.
Right.
Because you emphasize the red ant. And we sort of wanted to know why, because you emphasized how they react to different things differently to others. And what do you think the modern reoccupation of space would look like? What could be possible methods of reoccupation? What did you extract from looking at like the attack patterns? Just why that red ant analogy?
I think that was just the most important thing, to just the experiences of like red ants and as creatures. Like, if we don't want creatures in our house, so we're not gonna like we kill them. That was a very crazy analogy, but it was the truth. Like, you know, people see insects as monsters, but then it was also a thing of like, when I started working with the ant, actually truly like staring at it every single day, I saw that a lot of the stuff, or a lot of the things that the ants were doing, especially with movement and motion, when I was looking at the motion diagram, was all out of fear. Like a lot of the stuff that was happening, say like if somebody even moved the desk a little bit, the ants would like scurry and hide underneath the ground, or, you know, they will only dig canals at night because they knew they can feel the vibration. So they wouldn't come out in the day. And that was a really notable thing to look at, because I think it's just like, you know, being African American, you have to kind of tread a thin line, and especially being in white spaces, it can be very, very uncomfortable. And so like when I started, you know, really analyzing what the ant was doing, I was understanding that, well, a lot of the things that the ants are going through is just because they're just misunderstood. And I feel misunderstood. I mean, you know, so, and you know, that was just the whole premise of just making that analogy. It's just that, like, you know, we're just both the ant and me, we're just misunderstood people. Like, our community is misunderstood. So yeah, that was I hope that answered your question. That's what I got out of Got out of that analogy.
I have a really quick question. So while talking about modern buildings usually being white, and everyone understanding the connection between white being pure and good and all of that the wonderful synonyms that can go along with those words, and black being associated with evil and stains and dirt and filth, and we can continue going on and on about it.
Right.
I just wanted to entertain, what would it be like if we were to paint these buildings black? And that's just a question. Because, you know, I've seen with a lot of professors, architects, they praise these buildings that are just white, and white being associated with modernism and clean features. What, you know, because I don't want to say, what if these buildings were always black? Because you could assume that we would have, well, I mean, you can assume that. What would it be? What do you think would the response would be if we were to paint these buildings black?
I think I know a response and I have something immediately in my head, but I can't say it because we're recording. But I don't think it would, like, I'll put it this way. I don't think Farnsworth House would be as iconic if it was painted black. And that's for a reason. And that's why it was very important. It was very important for me to put that image of it just looking crazy, because I was just like, why do we put this on a pedestal? Like, what is so great about this? There's Black architects that make beautiful architecture, that make beautiful designs, beautiful pieces, but we don't lift them up. We only lift Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier. We spend like 3 months on them. Like, I don't want to talk about Le Corbusier. I don't care. Like, so I think that's, you know, that's the immediate response. Like, I don't think people would put it up. They wouldn't put it at a high caliber. They would just, like, I think a perfect example is just like high fashion and urban fashion. What is the first thing that they do when a Black person owns a fashion line? The first thing that they say is it's urban. What is that word?
Mm-hmm. And I think,
look at Sydney.
and I've often forgotten that color is a material.
Right.
Right. So yeah, that, once I said, we were just entertaining the fact that, you know, what if the world were just to be black? Color.
I would love it. I would love it. I mean, you know, looking at architecture, I mean, that's I love the color black. It's not because I'm Black, but I love the color black. It's my favorite color. Like, everything in my house is black. But, you know, I would love it, but you know how that goes. Like, you know how I'm not gonna say too much. You know where I'm getting at, though.
I would just think that, you know, it's a good proposition. A lot of people like wearing black to look slimming, to look professional. Sydney with the black turtleneck on. Hello.
There she. Hey.
Okay. I just think, you know, what if? But that's just my question. Thank you.
No problem.
And since we're closing, because it's almost 9 o'clock, so the last question I'll ask is, y'all already answered it, but how far does spatial violence go? We've already talked about it physically, mentally, internally, generationally. Like, how far does that go? You know, how far can it go? But at the same time, you've seen how far it can go.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. I guess it can go as far as, I guess, whomever is the dominant force want it to go, really. I mean, I think that a lot of the, I guess it's a topic that both are talking about, is erasure. And that to me is like my biggest fear like as someone that is Black, right, in America, is that, of course, I definitely have the thought about erasure of people, but just erasure of culture, like that violence there, to me is scary, right? Like even like we talk about language, everybody uses all of our vernacular, they move like us, you know, and I would say that in any circle, but a lot of our culture is just bastardized and like kind of like pimped out in a lot of ways without its proper respect. So I think that is like, that's kind of spatial erasure to me is like really is more of a metaphor for our for people in general. You know, that's scary.
All right. I mean, thank y'all for coming and just chatting for like 2.5 hours, basically. Thank you everyone who stayed the whole time. Thank you to the panelists who came up with amazing questions. I'm getting a round of applause. So, I mean, I'll just close out. Doing the little plugs. If you want more Pratt Futures events, go to Pratt Futures Instagram. We'll keep posting stuff there. And yeah, I mean, any last words from anyone? If not, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting us. I really, really appreciate it. Our world is normally pretty hectic in terms of like the studio on that. So I really enjoy moments where these discussions continue, you know, so like I be getting emotional, but like I really, this is to me like what I could do for the rest of my life right there. So I'm glad that you guys invited me to come, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Like, this was insane. I mean, like, this was an amazing conversation, and I hope you guys like keep doing this. Like, this is much needed. Pratt needs this right now. They need y'all.
Keep this coming.
I'm gonna do my best to keep this coming. But yeah, thank y'all for coming. If y'all want to go back and look at this, it'll be on YouTube at Pratt SOA event. And yeah, with that, good night, everyone, I guess.
Peace.
Peace.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna just end it. Wait, no, okay, I gotta save the chat. Awesome. All right. See ya.